I already start welcoming all of you slowly to today's panel session on water allocation and how we can reimagine permit systems in specific and allocation systems in general. As we know, the world is facing big water challenges. It's not a new topic. You're also in this session probably because you know that. And that is increasing the competition between different users. And that means that we need to start deciding who gets how much water for which purpose, under which conditions. And that then leads to how do we do that, and questioning and also discussing of the way we currently do it is appropriate or not. And this is what we want to explore in this session. Our panelists, our distinguished panelists, who I actually thank very much for being here and sharing their knowledge with us, will explore different considerations, different situations that affect this, from a more global scale to a more local specific examples. And then we will have a discussion on how we can reimagine this based on what is currently there and what would be important according to their expert opinion for us to move forward. And we still are waiting for more participants, but I guess I will just then continue. And given the informal characteristic of this panel and the idea of rather having a conversation, I want to invite all of the participants to type their questions in the Q&A, and then depending on the availability and the time that we have, we might ask you to unmute, or you can also raise your hands. And then Luke, thank you very much for our tech support. I will unmute you and allow you to talk and interact with the panelists. And then we can start with our first round of introduction of our panelists. Let's start with then the round that they will be presenting, which is Joita. You can start.
I'm Joita Gupta, professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I cover climate change, water, and a number of other related sustainability issues, and focus also on development studies.
My name is Hilmer Bosch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher contributing to the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. I have been doing research on property rights in water, or quasi-property rights in water, and water justice. And I work with Professor Gupta, Dr. Müller, and also with Luc. Thank you.
I'm Margot Hurlbert. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy, and I research on water in the Canadian prairies and South America.
Hi, I am Gianpaolo Dell'Angelo. I'm an Associate Professor of Water Governance and Politics at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam at the Institute for Environmental Studies. And I'm also the PI of a New Wave network, which focuses on training PhD students on water governance.
Great. Thank you very much. So as you see, we have different perspectives and different scopes that will make the whole discussion more interesting. And then how we will continue is basically each panelist will have a presentation. Then we have perhaps time for 1 or 2 questions. And then at the end, we will have a more overall discussion and general discussion with your questions and also cross questions from the panelists. So Joita, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's lovely to see all of you. What I would like to say today is that in this presentation, what I'm trying to do is to look at the 5,000 years of history and how it has affected the way in which we govern water. And then we are trying to look into the future and try to see how do we prevent the problems of the future. And my feeling is that these two notions, they clash with each other. And in that clash, the question is whether we will compromise on justice. And I don't know where this takes us in the allocation story, so I do not have answers, I have questions. So basically, in our narrative about the history of water law, what you see is that throughout the world, in the early days, there were civilizations that developed around water, and they made rules on water management. And those rules spread to the edges of the civilization, and then religion. Religion tried to deal with some of these rules, and they gave them a different character, but they still continued to spread through with the religion. So if Islam spread, it took Islamic law on water with it. Then you had the conquests and colonization, which brought British law or English law to all English colonies, including Canada and India. And then you have communism, and you have epistemic communities coming in. And then finally you have the neoliberal capitalism, which basically talks about how we can commercialize, commodify, and financialize the water system. That's sort of the history of water. And if you look at, in this process, the blue story is that the farmers, when we came to a sedentary process, the farmers had rights to the land and therefore also property rights to the water underneath. They had some degree of rights to the water that flowed along. And these rights were they became quite strong over time. There was also the principle in water law that you cannot cause harm to others. And you need to be careful about how you do that. And that was done through a lot of process rules. There was a discussion about the need for who can access water. So in Islamic law, the principle of the human right to water, first variation came up. And also that if you have shortage of water, you must prioritize it based on some idea of who needs water more than somebody else. And then you come to the allocation of water. And after you've accessed the water that is left, how do you allocate that between all the people? And even the access has to be allocated. So today, in today's world, because you're then allocating it through a concession. And then, of course, there are issues on transboundary issues. If you talk about the green water story, it's more implicit. Green water is within the land. So if you are a landowner, I'm pretty sure that the implicit implication is that the landowner has the control over the green water. When we're talking about water vapor or vapor in the sky, there's a lot of stories that tell us that it is actually belonging to the state. So that's, I think, the history we have on these two issues. Now, the current water, if you go back to what's happening now in different parts of the world, in blue, gray, black, etc., you do see that we have a series of existing property rights to water in most parts of the world, and that is related to land. If you create an infrastructure like a dam, you might get new types of property rights to water. The property rights are sometimes indefinite, sometimes they're short, they can be individual, they can be community. We will hear from Hilmer that the governments are trying to move water into the public domain. But this is the situation currently on the ground. In terms of harm, this has become much weaker because now apparently we are causing so much harm that there's too much politics in trying not to cause harm to others. In terms of access to water, this debate about whether there's a human right to water or sanitation took so long, and finally in 2010 we got that. And that's remarkable, but that doesn't mean it's implemented. And then you have the principle of priority of use, which was adopted by the UN Water Courses Convention, but it is not explored further in terms of which use is more important. Then you have the allocation of water, which I will not touch here. And again, you have the transboundary issues with respect to all of these. And today, people are also fighting about gray and black water, because if you control the water, then you can control a lot of society. So I just wanted to introduce this slide, just to basically say that many states worldwide are now trying to say we take the water back to us. But in the meanwhile, they are giving water property rights back because they're giving permits, contracts, concessions, etc. And that Hilmer will explain in much more detail. But the main problem is that this leads to policy freezing, and it hampers an adaptive water policy. Okay, that's the situation. Now let's look into the newer science. So in our Earth Commission work, what we did was we looked at the safe boundaries, the planetary boundaries, and then we asked if they were just. We're still revising some of the just boundaries, but you can see the just boundaries in blue and the green shows the safe boundaries. Now, just touching upon surface water, the idea of surface water is it should not vary more than 20% in relation to a baseline. And this ensures that downstream countries or downstream people also have a flow and that there is water flowing into the oceans. However, it does mean that upstream countries get less water. And so in fact, this story that is coming up from the natural scientists is a little contradictory to many of the ways in which we have been dealing with water before. And the question that we now have is, how do we allocate, as a theory, how do we allocate the surface runoff based on a 20% variation to different actors in society? And is that even possible? In terms of groundwater, the storyline is we should not take out more than we recharge, which seems quite reasonable, except that it will be quite painful for current farmers who overuse groundwater. So there is a justice issue there, but the idea is that we do not cause problems to the same farmer tomorrow because his land could subside, etc. In this graph, you see yellow balls. The yellow balls show you where we are today. And in most cases, globally, we are outside the boundaries. Now, the boundaries mean that the amount of water we can use at a basin level or at the global level or even at the groundwater level is limited. This has been also linked to water standards, but I won't discuss that here. What I'm trying to discuss is that if you have a limited boundary, and then you want to meet the minimum needs of people, then what you need to do, or what we have done so far, is to look at what is the minimum access to water, food, energy, infrastructure, clothing, healthcare, education, connectivity, from just minimum human rights. And if you meet these needs, because all of the other components also require water, food requires water, energy requires water, and so on. So you take this information, and let's assume we just do one level. So the level is escape from poverty. And then you calculate that if you give all people on Earth a minimum, what does it mean in terms of CO2 emissions? What does it mean in terms of the surface water used, the groundwater used, green water, plastics, etc.? And that way, you come up with a unit at the end, which is the same unit as the unit of the boundary. So you can actually calculate how much space there is. And that's really frightening when you think that that space is very different and very limited compared to the way we have been doing water analysis so far. And just to give you the story of climate change, in assuming that our current system goes in a business as usual system with a lot of AI, etc., there is a chance that even if you give all human beings worldwide just enough energy and food and water and housing and clothing to survive, then that will be above the boundary. And that means that we have a really complex problem of redistribution in addition to technology transfer. I hope that's clear. And then I think I will come to the shrinking ecospace governance discourses. And this brings me to the storyline that if you have limited water, then the markets, and that you might see in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water trying to move towards saying, maybe we need to have markets, maybe we need to privatize, maybe we need to price that. So there is a narrative coming that we must price water properly in order to make sure that we do it efficiently. I have a problem with that. The other option is, if you look at the rivers, the hegemonic approaches, upstream countries or Egypt in the case of the Nile, they claim that they want to have sovereignty over their resources, their securitization. That's a problem too. And then you have the polycentric approach, building on Eleanor Ostrom's work, where everybody is trying to make their own little governance story, and I don't think that will work either. And my feeling is, and that's what I'm trying to move in my coming couple of years, is going to try to work on a sort of a global constitution, a rule of law at the global level. It's just a storyline. But before I go on to the allocation of water, then there is the issue of allocation of harm. How do we deal with that? Do all activities harm the environment and water? I remember that in the policymaker summary at UNEP, the governments from the developing countries saying, are we vilifying agriculture? Are we vilifying development? And this is quite frightening because that's how they see it. The other thing is that the definition of what is substantial harm, does it change depending on the context? Is the tolerance for harm lower in 2030, 2050 because we have used up everything and we have polluted the water much more? So therefore, the tolerance for harm would have been much higher, maybe 20, 30 years ago. And then how do we deal with indirect harm into the water system, direct discharge, indirect discharge, etc. So it becomes really complicated to deal with this storyline. And today you see in the system globally that all companies are encouraged to disclose their harm, but does it reduce their liability? And that's a legal question, because if I tell you how much harm I'm doing and you don't stop me, then it's your problem as the government, not mine. Okay, so that's sort of a preemptive strike. Anyway, so basically what I'm trying to do is to look at the past paradigms and where do we come today? I'm looking at the future and where does it bring us? And what are the values and counter values? And how are we going to try to make a world of allocation? And I don't know how we do that in a way that we promote socio-ecological justice, but do not reproduce injustice. So that's basically what I wanted to say. And I think that living within the safe and just boundaries may reduce harm, but it also reduces how much water we can use and pollute. And that also means it reduces the amount of space for giving property rights, permits, and contracts. Meeting minimum needs increases the pressure on water. And can we meet this? And then there is a whole other story about infrastructure. And then, of course, there are transboundary water law issues that clash with these boundaries and make complications. And I conclude, based on this, we can't leave it to the economists, because yeah, that's what I feel, that if you give it to the economists, the water will go to the highest return on water. And it will not go to drinking water, it will go to biofuels, it will go to algorithms, it will go to AI. So that was my provocative conclusion, just having finished working on the Global Commission on the Economics of Waters report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joita, for this very good insight and overview and bringing together the historical perspective. I want to remind everyone to write their questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we still have time for one question directed to Joita. So you can also raise your hands if you have one question. If not, we will then continue with Hilmer's presentation. No questions in the Q&A and no hands raised. So Hilmer, I guess it's then up to you to continue, and then we can hopefully gather more questions for the final discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you for Joita for also introducing my topic. I would like to invite everybody, if they have questions also for my presentation or for Joita's, just type it in the text, because as Andrea said, we'll have a discussion later. So my presentation will be on evolving property rights in water and their impact on water allocation. This is a project also with IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, Wageningen University and Research, and it's been funded by the Dutch Ministry. Andrea, Dr. Müller is also part of this project, and also Professor Gupta and a student assistant, Alyosha Karp. So the problem basically is, as also mentioned by Joita, demand is in many regions is exceeding supply. There's limited water availability. We're consuming more. Also, water is more polluted. What Joita mentioned and explained, the safe and just boundaries for water already have been breached in many regions. So water reallocation in the end becomes inevitable. So our hypothesis, or what we think, is that property rights hinder water reallocation, which is what we are researching. So the gap in knowledge is there's limited scholarship on how water ownership is organized, how water is allocated through which policy instruments, how past and present water allocation instruments create quasi-property rights in water, and how this affects water reallocation. So the research question is, how are property rights in water globally organized? What problems does this create, and how can we address this issue, reimagining permits? So very simple, we understand quasi-property rights in water to resemble de jure, so legal property rights in water. So the same ends through different means. And if you want to read more about the whole theorization of this, I would like to refer you to the paper Joita and I published. It's Bosch and Gupta 2023. So far, what have we done? We have looked at 110 countries in the global south. We have done an analysis of 145 states in Argentina, India, Pakistan, and Somalia. We've already conducted the literature review. We've published an analysis of 60 countries. We've also looked at investor-state contracts that has of 53 countries, which has been published. The case studies are still ongoing. And recently, last month, we've published the Quasi-Property Rights Atlas, and there's a QR code at the end. So if you're interested, you can also look at that. So the main conclusions are that all countries have put water in a public domain, and they're responsible for the allocation of water. So the main instruments, the focus of our research in this presentation is the water use permits. Other means are contracts and concessions, historical water use, which is often, colonial water use is often continued in the current water laws, exempt water use and domestic use, those kind of exemptions to water use permits. Permits and contracts can lead to quasi-property rights in water, but this is the de facto privatization of water. This hinders water reallocation, exacerbates inequality, and the goal is just to create awareness, which is why I'm doing this presentation now, and also to preempt further water privatization. So I'm going through the conclusion in a little bit more detail. So as you can see in this map that most water resources are put in the public domain. There are a fewer exemptions to this, but it's a general trend that countries want to control their water and decide how they are allocating water. So the following map shows that water use permits are the most common instrument for water allocation. So the different colors of blue, all these countries allocate water through permits. Some also do through concessions. Some use the word concession for permit. Others use concession to allocate to public institutions. So this is still to be updated, but it does show a general trend on how water is allocated. And with permits, the idea is that it also gives states the flexibility to allocate and reallocate where needed. However, we based on the research, we see that through the rights that are being granted through these permits, that states basically grant them quasi-property rights. So they allocate a water use right, so they can use 1 million liters of water per year. They can do this in perpetuity or for 75 years. And if the state wants to take it away, they can claim compensation. And if the state takes it away, many countries allow permit holders to sue the state, to appeal or to object. And also in many cases, they can transfer the permit. Some require approval by the state and others do not, but the transfer basically results in the water is not returning to the public domain, which is problematic. And we see the same in investor-state contracts as well. So that it's the same rights that are being given with the same outcome. So this shows that the permit duration, many in dark red is in perpetuity, which is more seen in Latin America. Some don't specify it yet, which is also problematic because that's subject to corruption. So then maybe not to corruption, but states have more flexibility in for how long. And in certain countries up to 30 years. But it does show that permits are being granted for a significantly long period. And this map shows that in many countries, renewal is also possible. So if the period of 50 years has been finished, they can add another 20 years, and then it gets to 70 years, while in 2030, we are expected to already have massive issues. Permit annihilation, the transfer, certain countries say it's possible. The orange, only if it's authorized. So if you look at the green and orange, a huge number of countries do allow for the transfer of permits. South Africa had last year a constitutional court ruling giving more rights, or basically saying that permit holders, also historical colonial water rights can be traded. So it's also the judicial system that's important in specifying or shaping all these rights. Compensation, many countries do allow in certain instances to pay compensation. Based on my research in in Africa and Asia, often when water is taken back in the public domain, compensation can be claimed. Compensation, it's a long process, it's expensive, so states are reluctant to just simply take water back, which is problematic, and it limits them in controlling the water when needed. So the ultimate goal is to come up with some quasi-property rights index, and of course this is challenging. So how much weight do you put at the different elements? You can have $1 billion of compensation, but if you can only use the permit for a day, that kind of evens out, or then you can't really see it as quasi-property. So we're still kind of thinking about this and working on the methodology to come up with that. But Andrea is working on that. So this is what we hope to end up with. And we hope that can kind of help us in kind of spreading the message of how problematic it is. It hinders reallocation and exacerbates inequality in many regions. There's no water left to allocate. Redistribution is failing. So, for example, as seen in South Africa, they're struggling with the colonial property rights regimes while creating kind of a new quasi-property rights regimes. So the question is, who is holding the property rights and who is the water allocated to? In South Africa, in the majority of the all of the historical water rights are basically in the hand of the historical advantage. If you see at the number of permits and the volume of water that's being allocated, that also goes to the historical advantage because they have the land, the money, the means, etc. So it's actually worsening in certain situations. So to the concluding remark, putting water in the public domain does not exclude the privatization of water. So people have this idea, oh, we have it in the public domain, we can do whatever we want. That's not true. Past inequalities continues, exacerbated by new inequalities. And this affects the sharing of property rights, affect the sharing between different users, and nature. And as in certain regions, basins are already closing and a safe and just boundaries have been crossed. This creates massive problems. So to be clear, our point is we believe that water should not be privatized. We do this research to create more awareness of this problem, which many people are not aware of. And the challenge is finding the right balance between security and flexibility, and this requires reimagining of permits. So the last slide is the quasi-property rights atlas, which Andrea has been working on a lot, which is very exciting. It also explains more our conceptualization of the problem. It has some more maps. So I would like you to invite to have a look at that, and you can scan the QR code with your phone, and you're being directly redirected to the atlas. So thank you so much.
Just to add to what Hilma said, we must not misunderstand what Hilma was saying in the sense that we don't prefer a market to permits. We prefer the permit system with all its weaknesses to the market, because the open market will really commodify and financialize everything, whereas the permit system is still better, and that's the paper to be written.
Thank you for clarifying that, Judith. I appreciate it a lot. Now, we do not want markets, but we do, if you open the door of transferring, for example, that does open the door to kind of trading. And in the Global Commission, they were a big fan of that as well. We pushed back, so the struggle continues.
Thank you both for that important conclusion. And we do have two questions in the chat, but one is a general one and the other one is directed to Joita. So perhaps we can leave it for the end of the discussion, and then we can continue with Margot, and then we save time for everyone to write their own questions. So I'm sharing the screen now for that.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm going to dig down a little deeper into some specific case studies and aspects of water permitting and water rights. And this is a past but a current and ongoing research project funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It's a partnership grant, and it's happening in Canada, Argentina, and Chile and Uruguay, but I'm only going to speak about the three countries. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about water governance and the case studies in each of these countries, and a little bit about proposals for reform. Some of this is published previously, and some of it is not yet. Next slide. Okay, so starting with Argentina, the specific area of study is Mendoza, which is marked on the left side there, the orange area. And I couldn't tell from Hilmer and Joyita's work whether that was included or not. It's not Argentina in totality. It's only one region of Argentina, and it's a very specific wine producing region where the Malbecs, if you're a red wine drinker, originate from. It is an oasis that 5,000 years ago was started by indigenous people from water coming out of the Andes, from glaciers that melt, and the water comes from the Andes into the dryland area, and only where there is irrigation is there habitation. So Mendoza itself is a very large city that is built on the ancient indigenous irrigation systems. And what has happened is the wine industry has taken over in the last 100 years. There are many, many, many wine producers, small and large. And with climate change, the climate is changing such that the producers are locating in different areas. Next slide. So what we see is a different development happening in Mendoza, with wine producers moving upland or further into the hills. There was also about over a decade ago, Puerto Rios Dam built, which changed the water system as well for the benefit of the agricultural producers in the basin. So the unique nature of the water permitting in Argentina is that the water rights go with the land. So if you own a piece of property, then we call it the inherence principle. The water is part of that property, and it can't be transferred to anyone else. So it really is entailed, so to speak, with the actual piece of property that formed originally the Mendoza Oasis, but now in Mendoza goes with the property of the land. So in Mendoza proper, the actual city of Mendoza, the ancient city, the water is still with the piece of property, but in many situations, the residence is no longer an agricultural producer, but it's growing flowers or shrubs for the residents, the high-income residence owner. So the wine production has kind of changed where it is and where it's happening. Next slide. It's also very much operated by the DGI, which is the Department of Irrigation, but there's a very inequitable governance structure where the large producers have access to the highest functioning water entities and institutions, so directly to the superintendent of the DGI who makes decisions, the honorary administrative tribunal, the appeals courts, whereas medium producers and small producers work with the local tomeros in their irrigation districts and don't have access to those bigger institutional structures. Next slide. So there's a rigid supply management system that coincides with the aqueducts and the 5,000-year-old, in some cases, water distribution system, so that when climate change and the needs of the specific crops that the producers are growing, which are not always wine. So in Argentina and Mendoza, they're also producing the vegetables and the fruits that they need for their food security, but they're absolutely unable to change the amount of water that's being delivered to their property. So there's an inability to adapt to both changing land use, where residences are getting water for their flowers, and producers producing fruit and vegetables are unable to produce that food to feed the population. But then the wine producers who are shipping wine internationally, and especially the very large wine producers, are able to access the power and the necessary appeals court to enforce their water rights and make sure that they are protected. And groundwater has become an issue increasingly for the medium and large producers to meet the shortages that are happening because of the going on 10 or 12-year drought that's occurring in Mendoza. Next slide. So there are potential reforms I've listed here, but because of time, I think I will leave those for the discussion in the context of all of the case studies we have before you. Next slide. And talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada. So Canada is the permit system that is government run and government organized, which is sometimes good and sometimes not so good. So what's happening right now in Saskatchewan is we are expanding our irrigated agriculture. So next slide. So about 1.15 billion Canadian dollars. So that's probably about a billion, just under €1 billion, is being spent in order to expand Saskatchewan irrigated agriculture, and to the benefit of about a handful of agricultural producers. So it'll benefit approximately, I calculated it in square kilometers, 364 square kilometers of land where producers will be able to adapt to climate change and to the receding glaciers and increasing drought and aridity that's happening in the Canadian plains. So it is very disastrous for the downstream Indigenous communities whose water is necessary for, we have some incredible inland basins at the west side of Saskatchewan where our Indigenous people live. And these people do not have clean drinking water. They're having to increasingly access our groundwater. And in Saskatchewan, it's very saline. It's very salty. So it's not as good as the the water coming through the river system that's now being dominated by irrigation producers. Next slide. And in Chile, I think many of you will know that Chile constitution says that it is for the state, but in reality, it's been sold through permit, and it's not in perpetuity. So it's a privatized water market that's happening in Santiago, Chile. Next slide. So this project, we're actually, instead of working in northern Chile, where they've had successive droughts, we're working in Santiago. That's the Aconcagua watershed, where they are having droughts, but they're also having climate change and changing development with more avocados higher up again in the Andes, where the producers can, let's say, rob and pilfer the water before it gets downstream into the communities of Valparaiso and Santiago, so to the detriment of people downstream. Next slide. And many of you know that the Chilean people tried to write a new constitution dealing with water in 2022, 2023. But part of what happened was not only did they want to deal with their water system and the privatized water and change what has happened in the past with Pinochet's government, but they also wanted to make food and cultural rights predominant in the Chilean system. So because they attempted to do too much, their water constitutional change failed, and now they're changing some of their water code, but it's almost too little, too late to actually make significant changes. So from our preliminary work, we're thinking about, we need to talk about what we mean by improvement. Similar to Joyida's comments, economics and improving gross domestic product through privatization, through expanding our irrigation, may not be the answer for adaptation as we're thinking of it. But we need to be able to resolve on the ground the policy conflict that's happening, the conflict between users and allocations, and adding that flexibility, but also protecting equity in our allocations. So in Argentina, there's a very rigid and 5,000-year property system that is under discussion about how it could or should change, and strengthening this water balance, not only in our green water, but also our groundwater and the relationship that's happening with it. So tackling these compound risks and also the cascading impacts that are happening. So next slide, I think it's the last one. Okay, yes, so the name of the project is Bridging the Water Adaptation Gap, happening in the 4 countries, and that's our funder. So I think I'm out of time, but end there. Thank you, Andrea, for my slides.
Thank you for this very interesting case, not biased at all, not because I'm Chilean, but
One clarificatory question.
Sure.
yeah, we have time.
Were you talking about, are the grape farmers, are they pumping out the water and therefore there's less groundwater for somebody else? So
Correct.
even though the water on the land is belonging to this farmer, it gets pumped out from underneath for somebody else.
Yes, and generally in Chile and Argentina, the drinking water for communities comes from the groundwater, often, depending, not 100%, right? And that's who's prejudiced by this groundwater pumping that's happening, which also, they need a lot of electricity to do this. So we talk about adaptation, but I think as researchers, we need to be thinking about what's maladaptation.
Indeed, a very important concept, actually. So I hope we get the chance to discuss about that. And then I open the floor to Jampel, our last presentation, then we can continue with a nice and interesting discussion.
Sure, thanks. Let me share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yeah, we see the slide. Great.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for inviting me to join this session. I particularly appreciated the previous interventions, and I think that somehow we are thinking along the same lines, and perhaps also dealing with similar type of concerns. In Joyita's Gupta presentation, there was a reference to Elinor Ostrom, which is somehow what informs theoretically this quick presentation. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues Paolo Dodorico and Cristina Rulli, who differently than myself are hydrologists, and I believe that they are the type of people that we need to involve when we speak about water. This seems quite something quite simple to say, but I agree on the fact that the role of economists these days should perhaps be questioned to a certain extent, especially when it comes to understanding dynamics that are not just related to economics, but have a strong biophysical component. So I would like to start perhaps framing a little bit and going back to some of the narratives that have informed not only academia, but also policymaking, especially starting from the 80s, especially starting from the neoliberal turn. So this is a quote from Garrett Hardin, his famous or infamous paper published in Science in 1968, where he defined the term that then became one of the most cited terms in environmental governance. If you just look at how many times his paper has been cited, you can see that it's really a foundational piece for environmental governance. The fun fact is that Garrett Hardin had absolutely no intention to speak about the commons. So his paper was really about overpopulation, with a very strong reactionary right-wing, almost racist, north-centric, ignorant, deterministic type of approach. And it seemed like that the example of the tragedy of the commons, the previous example he actually makes in his paper, it's always a fun read, is about a parking slot. And then he moves on speaking about herders. And what is interesting, long story made short, is that fundamentally he divides the world into two dimensions, and we are in full-on Cold War. And so the two point of references that he refers to are mainly the market system, the capitalistic system, and then the so-called Leviathan state intervention. He's speaking to the other side of the world. And it seems like that the only way that there is fundamentally to manage natural resources is either through privatization or strong market intervention. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, there will be a tragedy, and natural resources will be depleted. People will fight and eventually die in a fundamentally Malthusian way. It takes several years before Elinor Ostrom actually wins her Nobel Prize in economics, being a political scientist, first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And her work is actually awarded based on the motivation that she was able to contribute to dismantle this myth that the only way that there is to manage the commons is through these two binary solutions. And it is quite obvious. I mean, most of the world works in a different way than the one that is depicted by Hardin. There are rural populations in the global south, and pastoralists are actually a good example, that have been developing their system of existence and then their cosmology all the way to their systems of production in a way that is actually very much embedded in governing the commons rather than depleting them. So this is a little bit of the background, but then I want to perhaps move from the theory to the real world out there. In 2008, something unprecedented happened, scholars, agrarian scholars, refer to mainly the work that has been connected with the idea that the subprime crisis, the financial crisis, mainly is in a simultaneous interdependent polycrisis. It was during the same year there were dramatic climate events and food production shortages. Long story made short, from 2008, an incredible, gigantic, unprecedented wave of investments in the global south on land start. And this is very much related to a full body of literature that focuses on so-called land grabbing. There is a lot that has been written on land grabbing, speaking of the phenomenon as a phenomenon that is actually, for the magnitude and for the type of radical shift that it creates in control over land, even more dramatic than colonialism to a certain extent. The type of direct control and dispossession that the recent wave, the contemporary wave of land grabbing has produced, has under certain type of criteria some typologies of impacts that are even more dramatic than colonialism. This is some of the contribution that, for example, Lorenzo Cotula makes. Recently, 1 year ago, together with Paolo and Cristina, we published a policy forum in Science where we alerted the fact that with the occupation of Ukraine and the global shock on the food markets, the risk would have been to actually create a new revamped wave of land grabs. And this was actually something that we anticipated, and it seems like it's going exactly in that direction. So the narrative around land grabs mainly is very strongly connected to the idea that there are empty lands. That these are wastelands. If you look at the reports, there are some early reports from FAO, from the World Bank. Actually, I forgot to mention that many of these international organizations throughout the 80s, after the neoliberal turn, were actually using the logic of the tragedy of the commons to implement reforms and structural adjustment programs that were very much based on the idea that privatization is actually good for the environment itself. It's good for the countries in the global south itself. And some of these narratives are actually hard to die. And all of a sudden, we started to read that large-scale land acquisitions, the sort of more neutral term, are good because of bringing investment, bringing capacity, skill, labor, technology to empty lands. So we clearly know that there is no empty land, and this is also one of the wrong myths that was reproduced by Garrett Hardin. What he was really referring to was the tragedy of open access, which is completely different than commons. And so the idea is that that mainly poor countries can boost their development, moving from empty lands to industrial agriculture. We have worked on this phenomenon at the global level. So we have conducted many global assessments involving a multidisciplinary team with a hydrologist, environmental scientist, and also social scientists. And of course, the social implications are very strong, but the biophysical implications are also quite clear. So when large-scale land acquisitions are happening, gigantic amounts of land, which are actually inhabited by traditional communities, by pastoralists, by small-scale farmers, are transformed in a completely different type of land use. So they move from small-scale farming to large-scale agriculture, mechanized industrial agriculture. And guess what? This is something that has huge implications on water. We studied the hydrological impacts of large-scale land acquisitions, and the implications on water are so strong that to a certain extent we can actually speak about the fact that in reality the global land rush is not it's not a rush about land, it's a rush about water. When we think about investment funds often backed by national governments for security reasons, investing in let's say Ethiopia, or in the area of in the water-rich area of sub-Saharan Africa, what they're going after is not land. What they're going after is water. So this is a little bit of the, let's say, the materialistic historical background that I am relating to. And in March 2024, I think something that is particularly important to mention happened, which was the UN Water Conference. So this was the first UN Water Conference that happened after the previous one in 1979 in Montevideo, if I'm correct. And with our New Wave team and a bunch of colleagues and then water governance PhD students, we were there full of optimism, thinking that it would have been a platform to gather and really to get ideas and perspectives from different representations. And something that was very clear to us is that it was not a state general type of thing. It was more of a situation where they needed the scientific community, they needed the indigenous representatives, they needed the youth, all of the different type of representatives to legitimize an agenda that was already defined. And this agenda, in my opinion, is not so different than the Chicago Boys neoliberal solution 2.0. So an agenda of investment, privatization, economic control over water resources, with some very clear priorities, and in my opinion, some very clear winners and some very clear losers. And this is something that I believe, how am I doing in time? Sorry, I don't have a...
Well, there are no questions, so you have like 3 minutes left, but we're no pressure because there are not many questions. Go ahead.
So I'll still have to speed up and wrap it up. But how does all of this come together? The opinion, my impression is that what is happening is really a new wave of commodification and dispossession of the commons. And what I'm particularly concerned of is the water commons. And so with Paolo Dodorica and Cristina Rulli, we developed perhaps a framework that is still up for discussion, where we are trying to think about what are water commons and how are they being dispossessed within the context of land grabbing, of global appropriation of resources in the global south, under the new framework, the new, let's say, perhaps emerging global water agenda that is coming out of discussions from the UN Water Conference. And I think that's something that is important, and I really see a lot of connections with the work that Hilmer, Margot, and Joita are doing, is that a theory of property is short. In order to understand the water commons, first of all, we need to engage very seriously with the hydrological dimension. And it is a complex dimension that is also fluid and changing, and it involves typologies of water that we are not perhaps used to deal with. So I think a fair question is, what are water commons from from a hydrological point of view. If we define commons in an Ostromian way as common pool resources governed by common property regimes, but then we do need to add the biophysical dimension, and I think that this is something to still think about. And then the other aspect is that if we are aware of the fact that a theory of property is very, very limiting when we are dealing with the commons, also because it reproduces a type of narrative that then favors privatization. It favors a certain type of control and institutional arrangements over water resources. Then I think it is useful to borrow the theory of access. And I'm going back to the work of Nancy Peluso and Jesse Ribot from 2003. And so we did propose a framework, a heuristic framework that has been published in Nature Water recently. And we're trying to think about grabbing water commons as not only a multidimensional type of dynamic, but actually something that relates with tenure, relates with power relations, possession, and different typologies of claims. And if we start thinking about the grabbing water commons in this sort of more multidimensional way, and also applying a hydrological perspective, I think that there are some interesting aspects that will come through, and perhaps we will also be able to identify more clearly who are the winners and losers of new types of neoliberal paradigms. So concluding, under neoliberal globalizations, water commons are often a preferential targets of an unrestricted speculation over natural resources. And this is a serious threat to community-based customary water governance arrangements, which contributes to the dismantlement of underlying norms, traditions, and institutions. And it raises water justice and sustainability concerns. And I think we need to really reemphasize the importance of water commons. So they relate to environmental conservation, food security, livelihoods, traditional communities around the world. And unfortunately, they lack adequate protection. And this is why I believe that legal approaches are particularly important in this case. And it is necessary to involve social and environmental movements, international organizations, and governmental bodies. And I think that this is really something that I see that Joita and Hilmer are actually now very much engaged with. So I'm curious to hear how that is going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jampel. And thank you all for your very good presentations. We have a couple of directed questions and then two other general. So let's start with the directed ones. Joita, I saw that you replied to Peter's question in the Q&A, but perhaps I will read out the question anyway, and then you can reply for all the rest of the attendees. So Joita, thank you for your presentation. There has been significant frustration regarding global water governance in the past. While drafting the global constitution, do you expect a similar struggle? If yes, how would you make the proposal more viable?
So I'm extremely frustrated with climate governance, global AI governance, water governance. It's just one long list of frustrations. And then I thought I would take the other tack and see, can we come up with open science justice lab on a global constitution? So the idea is that we have 3 students who look and research into various aspects of constitutions. So that's the theory basis and maybe the empirical stuff. But there is also a dimension, which is an essay competition. There's no prize. Everyone that writes a decent essay about what they think is important for inclusion in the Constitution becomes a contributory author. So the idea is that we try to create a community of like-minded or even unlike-minded people thinking about how we are going to manage our global resources and share it as equitably as possible, and how we take responsibility for the harm that we cause to others. So that's this little story, and it's a bit of an exciting little research project. I do have a little UN position, but I wanted to come back to why Jampel last year came, if I may, in this answer, it's because the United States and China have not paid their dues to the UN. And as a consequence, the Secretariat is so squeezed that they just wait for money, and the money comes from the private sector, and then the private sector dictates the agenda. And I am seeing that in my own role as an independent advisor, that there's no money for my role, even though it's a formal position, and there's nothing in that whole group. But there's all these businesses who come inside and say, okay, AI will solve all the water problems of the world. So that's what I'm seeing. Anyway, to link those two questions. But everybody here is invited to join the Constitution Party.
Thank you, Joita. Also, whenever you have questions among yourselves, then feel also free to just unmute yourself, and then you can talk to each other. In the meantime, Margot has also one question, and then we go to Jampel's question and the general ones. So Dr. Holbert, thank you very much for your presentation. Listening to the challenges you've described, I was wondering if you could share some ideas on how to ensure effective mechanisms to respond to situations where water is infringed upon. How to ensure a just response can be implemented? You're muted, Margot.
Thanks. Great question, Paulina. And boy, yeah, I was really thinking throughout all these wonderful presentations about exactly that. And what can we learn from the polar opposites of a privatized Chilean market, right? And then a government-run Canadian system and an Argentinian completely supply-side managed system, right? We've got just, and polar isn't the right word because there's three extremely different systems, and how to actually effect Jampel's idea about preserving the commons, because the legal instruments we've used historically to like the human right to water, advancing it in combating the privatized water market, right? By recognizing and enforcing the human right to water, hasn't had the success that we've wanted to protect the amount of water in rivers so that fish and fauna have rights as well of not being denied of water and extinction because of dried out riverbeds, has not worked in the context of climate change. So what are the legal instruments and avenues that we could use, because a holus bolus change in system doesn't appear to be on the horizon. In the policy world, we seem to do things with that, excuse my analogy of, we have this soup of instruments that have to enter into the political sphere when we elect our governments, and then they'll seize on one instrument as a fix-all and end-all, and it hasn't worked in the past. But the Chilean example of constitutional reform also didn't work in the current context of polarization in the media and in our political spheres, in our elections that are happening in the United States and in Canada right now. So I'm grasping for, how do we solve this problem that we're describing, and is not new, has existed. And as scholars, I think we have to talk about power and injustice more, and roll up our sleeves, so to speak, with not just sitting in our armchairs and talking to one another. Here are 15 people that probably are like-minded. I haven't surveyed them all, but we need to actually get out into the world and make that change and try resolving that conflict through maybe new research methods of participatory action research, where we actually try to come up with a couple feasible pathways of policy mixes that will find the solution. And I don't think me, Margot, coming up with the solution is going to, in this current political context, is going to solve all the problems, right? It's going to have to be through working with the civil society organizations and as well our water rights holders that are holding so many of the rights and so much of the power. I don't know that as that's telling you anything new. Maybe Jaida has some better ideas.
Maybe at the discussion.
Good. Thank you very much, Margot. And then we have one last directed question to Jambel, also from Paulina. Thank you for your questions. Dr. Delangelo, thank you very much for your critical intervention. I was wondering whether you could help us understand why it is important to have clarity on what we mean when we speak about the commons. Isn't this a defining task that risks further complexification of the bigger picture to non-experts?
Yeah, no, I think that it's a very good question, and it's actually something that I really spend a lot of time when I'm teaching to my students, to the extent that perhaps they see my analytical attention to the definition of the comments as a little bit of an obsession. But the thing is that words matter, and if you think about the fact that the entire Hardinian perspective on the tragedy of the commons was actually a misrepresentation of what the commons are, and this is something that Elinor Ostrom clarifies, and she gets a Nobel for it. And it's fundamental to understand the difference, for example, between commons and open access. So mainly open access, goes back to the Roman jurisprudence, and it refers to a situation where I think in Latin jurisprudence referred to res nullius, where maybe Joita can correct me here, but the idea is that there is no claims, there are no claims, there are no property or institutions. It's and the question is, where is that on the earth?
Yeah.
While when you're speaking about the commons, you are referring to institutions, common property institutions that imply that there are claims, that there is people, that there are conflicting claims over who owns a certain type of resource. And that is also why we need to expand beyond the theory of property. We need to understand who is involved over a certain type of resource. And the idea that if, for example, an analytical confusion between the understanding the difference between open access and commons is really important, because if you are saying that there is a tragedy of open access, then that means that there is nobody that is governing, there is nobody that is taking care, and then you can justify a sort of exploitive type of approach over a resource, not the sort of far west logic or reaching a resource and taking over it because it doesn't belong to anyone.
So, Jampel, if I can just jump in the Global Commission, we kept trying to say in our team that it is the hydrological cycle which is a commons, because we were very afraid that if we were talking about water as being out there and not having already been subject to a large number of different types of rights, then basically somebody would just come in and grab it. And that was one of the most important things. And I don't see myself that anywhere in the world that there is no existing rights system. It might have been a community rights system, it might have been an individual rights system. And all through history, there was a storyline that somehow people had a relationship with water. If you were indigenous, it was a relationship. And in fact, the definition of property is a relationship with land or a relationship with water. So it's quite close. But my point actually is that the problem started when we started to go into the great acceleration. Till then, so in Islam, there was a rule called the right to irrigate. So farmers had the right to do what they were because they were sitting on their own lands. It was not like somebody from somewhere else coming and doing grapes over here, and so the problem has been actually that through the industrialization process, people are trying to innovate new ways of getting control over that land. It's not, in my view, it's not a commons. It belongs to a local community. I come and grab it from them. Actually, I dispossess them. And I dispossess them because they are very poor and they need money because their wife is is sick, or their child needs a marriage or whatever. And they take the money and they lose everything because their income is farming. So sometimes, I mean, this is a good debate we could have in a paper about the pros and cons of using a commons approach. Because for me, I would stick my guns to saying, you know, the water is already allocated. The question is, how do we allocate it better? Rather than to say, hey, it's not allocated, markets just come in and grab the water. I'm making a caricature.
Oh,
So
I'm absolutely there with you, and I think this narrative of empty lands, you know, that I started with, empty waters. That is the logic of open access, no? But again, I believe that theoretically there is no open access. The open access was what colonizers or what invaders of the American continent were doing when they were dehumanizing the local populations, right? So I think that it is fundamental to really bring back analytical and clear, also legal meaning to the term commons. And I'm really curious to know more about the debate on how the term commons is used in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, because I think that, and this comes to the answer to Paulina, that the meaning that we understand and give to that word will have implications at the legal level, at the economic level, and will mainly allow or not allow certain type of systems of exploitation. So I think it is quite a fundamental analytical term that I find it pretty entertaining how it goes back to 1968 to Garrett Hardin, and it has characterized so much all of like the neoliberal policies moving forward, you know. So, but yes, I would love to follow up on this conversation.
Just to go back on this, so that's why we plugged in Andrea's figure on the fact that actually the most important tool used to allocate water is permits, and that it's not a market where you can just go and buy and sell. That, I mean, that was one of the things we tried to squeeze in to try to change the framing that there was going to be, that there was. But it was a bit of a...
Oh, you muted yourself, Joita.
That was a bit of a complicated story, and it is, I'm curious what you would think of the final product, because what you will probably see is that there were different authors and there's different storylines.
So I guess we have time now for two other questions, and I will start with the question of Paulina. Another question would be about the general concept of permits and rights. Is there a risk that this phrasing can isolate certain groups? How do we ensure that the discussion and decisions regarding water rights and or permits are inclusive? Is the language that we can use to ensure that diverse worldviews are heard, acknowledged, and represented? Similarly, are there spaces for such pluralistic connection? And I was thinking that perhaps Hilmar can start with his study as well.
Well, I can share from my research where I looked at Africa and Asia, and what generally happens is that the big water users apply for a permit, or the historical water right is recognized, and basically all the water of the small users or of customary rights or indigenous rights are often all put under domestic use. So Barbara van Koppen, I think what has started during colonization continues under the new water law, that all these alternative ways of accessing water are just not being recognized under the contemporary water laws. And I think the only exemption is Tanzania, that basically says we recognize customary water rights. So in our research, we work with the language of the water laws that have been given. We do recognize that that this language is deeply imbued in neoliberalism, and yet within a water system justice framework, we do think there's recognition justice needed, where we do recognize other people's knowledges and ontologies and interacting with water. How this fits within the current legal system is, of course, the question.
Thank you. Does anyone want to also answer that question?
I can take a try. And I really love this panel because we're using ideas and concepts that don't really mesh together well. There's a contradiction, right? That we're kind of sussing out. And I think too, myself personally, when we get into how are we going to fix this, I get very prescriptive in policy instruments and things that can make real change and are practical. But I don't think we should lose sight of that reimagining space where we move out of the lawyer legal land, coming up with a law or a policy that's going to fix it, to think about how we make social change and have people think about water and the relationships with water differently so that we can reimagine a system and a relationship that eventually will come into being. So with that question about how do we make sure that indigenous worldviews and different worldviews of the commons, even thinking about cooperatives and the commons, a different relationship with water isn't lost, I think is really important. And how do we do that? How do we engage in our communities in that deep, meaningful way that takes a lot of time, and not always people want to spend that time. So working with Indigenous people in Canada, it takes a lot of time in that with water, we have to go back to land-based practices and understanding the importance of the relationship with water. So it's a completely different paradigm and a different fora than we're used to in that engagement. So how do we mainstream and upscale thinking differently about our water and our relationships in a backward way of coming at reform? And maybe I'll leave it there.
We have been, Hilma and I have been grappling with this question. If other communities see water as a gift of God, or they see it as a living being, or they see it as a relationship with humans, that we are not separate from, we are together. So that's a storyline. And on the other hand, there are people who see water as H2O because water is H2O. So you have a contradiction at that level, which is very difficult to reconcile. The way I approach this now is that whether you are indigenous or Muslim or Hindu or not, you have transactions with water. And at that transactional level, is there a way in which we can find ways to deal with this contradiction? Because at the ontological level, you cannot bring it together. All I think you can learn from ancient history. So in Hindu law, it was simply you can never own water. It comes, you use it, it goes off. You use it in a farm, it goes off. So be respectful about water, and you see the same kind of principles coming back and forth in almost every single culture. And so I think the message you get from that is respect for the system. And don't say, if I take more water out, I'll put more water here, and then it's all right. And that's the compensation, the offsetting principle you're seeing now all over the world with carbon offsets, etc. So I think the main storyline for me is the message from those systems is respect and mutuality, reciprocity, which are very key elements of international law. So in that sense, I feel at home. And then I go to the transactional level. You're taking water, we are taking water. And I think you can take the water because you hardly pollute it. And can I pollute your water because the water systems are... So in that sense, at the transactional level, how can we deal with this issue, and how can we deal with the land grabbing, which is again a transaction?
Jump Bill, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Water has different meanings to different people, but it also has different meaning to the same person. So water can represent different things, and so of course, if we are looking at an ontology of water, then it is certainly not one where you can put things in Weberian boxes. But what is really complex with water is that it constantly changes, and very often it also becomes invisible. So a big part of the global hydrological cycle is actually virtual. And I think Hilmar, you were referring that now the director of the WTO is involved in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which I don't know how to take this. I think it could be a very good or a very bad news. But we conducted a study a few years ago with a master's student, and we looked at how often is virtual water acknowledged in WTO regulation, and the result was 0. And most of the hydrological balances of countries is actually based on virtual water. So just, like the common idea that a kilogram of beef consumes 16,000 liters of water. And that is something that is virtually not used in Argentina for other purposes, for the ecosystem, or for feeding small-scale farmers, and it's virtually exported, creating, as you said, Joita, creating a transaction, a real transaction. And then it's virtually exported to another country. And this is one thing that I think we should always consider, that there is the fluidity, and there is the fact that often we don't see water. And the other aspect that is important is that perhaps we should also move and try to make an effort to think a little bit less anthropocentrically. And also there are, interesting conversations where I have mixed feelings, but I think are important, around, for example, giving the rights to rivers, and therefore, then what is the ontology of water beyond transactions, and how do we protect water when it has actually an intrinsic right, to avoid that then it becomes object of dispossession because it is I don't know, because it doesn't belong to anyone. So I mean, I have more questions than answers, frankly, but
Probably
That's what
we
I
all
said.
have.
If I
And
can
just one
quickly,
minute, but yeah, Hilmar wanted to.
yeah, if I can quickly go to Ngozi of the World Trade Organization, she is aware of the concept of virtual water. I think, Julia, correctly if I'm wrong, she is in favor of that, and she also likes to talk about the 3 E's of equity, efficiency, and environmental. I think that's it. So she is aware of that, but also, what are the implications if you suddenly say like that region is water rich, that can benefit the global north, or you kind of get these dynamics, and what does that mean for investments? Quickly coming back to what you mentioned on the land grabbing, I've analyzed 80 investor state contracts, and I even came across a contract in South Sudan where 1 million hectares was being sold or leased for 99 years, and it could be extended for another 50 years, and they could take all the water they want. And if they take away the water or it impacts their business, they can go to the under the World Trade Organization bilateral investment treaties and sue the state. So if you kind of allocate an area with green water and you say, well, that's an interesting region, global north countries are jumping on it, protected under this system. So I kind of see also the negative side that can have. So I'm a bit puzzled at what you said. Depends on what direction it goes. Sorry if I took too long, Andrea.
No, that's good. But we just read the end of the session. Definitely, I was of course we wouldn't get to all the main answers, but we have many important points to take. This is definitely not something. So the main point is this is definitely not something that one can reach alone, one government, one discipline, or just one approach. And this is therefore the challenge. So I thank you very much for this very nice and interesting conversation. Lots of food for thought. And I don't know if you have any last words, and thank you all the attendees as well.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Andrea,
much, Andrea, for
sharing.
hosting. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.